Thanks for tuning in to Echoes of Cheating. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. John Mercer stood at the pinnacle of the life he'd built. From the modest upbringing to a sprawling estate overlooking the Pacific, his story was one of determination, grit, and success. He had everything: a thriving investment portfolio, a sterling reputation in the financial world, and a family he believed was his greatest treasure. At 48, John's days were filled with power moves in boardrooms and quiet evenings at home with his wife Clara and their 22-year-old daughter Emily. Life was flawless, or so it seemed. That morning had been like any other. Clara had kissed him on the cheek before leaving for what she described as another meeting with her charity group. Her silk scarf smelled faintly of expensive perfume, and her smile had been practiced but polite. Meanwhile, Emily, always the picture of ambition, had darted out of the house, mumbling something about a study session with friends. John barely had time to process their departures, diving into his usual conference calls and market analysis. Yet an inexplicable unease lingered. The first crack appeared on a Thursday evening. Clara returned home hours later than usual, her hair slightly mussed and her cheeks flushed. When John asked about the event, her response was quick but vague. "Just the usual, darling. You know how these galas run late." He nodded, dismissing the odd note in her voice, chalking it up to exhaustion. That night, he reminded himself of the countless times Clara had worked tirelessly for her causes, never suspecting her explanations might hold less charity than deceit. Emily, too, began acting strangely. Once his confidant, she now spent hours locked in her room or glued to her phone. Their dinner conversations, once filled with her dreams of becoming a writer, had dwindled to monosyllabic answers. She skipped their weekend breakfasts, her excuse always being her mounting workload. John missed her laugh, the one that used to echo through the house, but again he rationalized her behavior. "She's growing up," he told himself, "finding her independence." But no rationalization could explain the financial irregularities that emerged a week later. John had always prided himself on his meticulous attention to detail, and as he reviewed the monthly statements from his financial advisor, a glaring anomaly surfaced: a $250,000 transfer to an unfamiliar account. His pulse quickened. The explanation that followed, a fabricated investment opportunity, did little to assuage his concerns. The next day, another unsettling detail came to light. A series of smaller, unauthorized withdrawals had been routed through a shell company tied to international accounts. Panic gave way to suspicion. This wasn't just an accounting error, it was intentional. As he traced the origins of these transactions, John felt his world shift. He wasn't simply the target of fraud, he was being deceived by someone close to him. Clara's recent absences and Emily's distant behavior began to take on new meaning. He combed through emails and receipts, piecing together fragmented details. He found unexplained donations to obscure charities and a charge for a luxury hotel suite booked under an alias he didn't recognize. One evening, John decided to follow Clara, carefully tailing her car to a high-end restaurant in the city. Through the dim glow of the restaurant's windows, he saw her seated with a man who wasn't him. The stranger leaned in close, his hand brushing hers as she laughed at something he said. John's heart sank, but he wasn't ready to confront her yet. He needed proof. Returning home that night, he found Emily's bedroom door slightly ajar. Inside, on her desk, lay an envelope addressed to someone named Victor Hayes. The contents, a mix of financial documents and personal notes, painted a grim picture. His daughter was complicit in whatever scheme Clara was involved in. For the first time, John questioned everything. Had his life been as perfect as he believed? Or was it a mirage crafted by those he loved most? He resolved to find the truth, no matter the cost. Hidden betrayals had a way of coming to light, and John Mercer was determined to expose every shadow. The first thing John noticed about Victor Hayes was his charm. When the private investigator, Graham Fields, handed over the initial report, John stared at Victor's photo for a long time. Sharp features, an easy smile, and a carefully dishevelled look that seemed designed to disarm. This was a man who knew how to work his angles, a professional manipulator. "Your wife's been meeting him regularly," Fields explained, laying out a series of photos on the desk. Dinners, hotel stays, and one visit to a yacht moored off the coast. He's not just your average playboy either. He's got a rap sheet, fraud, embezzlement, and a penchant for conning women out of their fortunes. John's grip tightened on the armrest of his chair, his knuckles white. "And my daughter?" His voice was low, controlled. The rage simmered beneath the surface. Fields hesitated. "She's involved. Not in the way your wife is, but Victor's gotten to her too. He's been feeding her a story about you, about your business dealings. He's convincing her that your wealth was built on corruption." John clenched his jaw. The thought of Emily, his Emily, falling prey to this man's lies felt like a fresh betrayal. It wasn't just about the money or even the affair anymore. It was about how Victor had infiltrated his family, twisting their perceptions and loyalty against him. The more John delved into Victor's background, the more he realized how meticulous the man was. Victor didn't just seduce women, he built narratives. He tailored his approach to their vulnerabilities, presenting himself as the answer to whatever they lacked. For Clara, it seemed to be adventure and passion, the thrill of being swept off her feet. For Emily, it was idealism, her desire to make a difference in the world. Emily's transformation hadn't happened overnight. Through his investigators, John discovered that Victor had approached her under the guise of philanthropy. He'd portrayed himself as a modern-day Robin Hood, someone who redirected the ill-gotten gains of the wealthy to those in need. He filled her head with tales of corporate greed and exploitation, painting John as the villain. It started with small conversations, then escalated. Victor had introduced Emily to a network of fake activists, a front designed to reinforce his narrative. They praised her efforts, lauded her intelligence, and encouraged her to question everything her father stood for. The street speakers? The street speakers. The money wasn't going to charities. It was vanishing into Victor's offshore accounts. The betrayal cut deep, but it was the naivety of Emily's involvement that stung the most. She wasn't malicious, John realized. She genuinely believed she was doing the right thing, blinded by Victor's charisma and her own youthful need to rebel. Meanwhile, Clara's complicity was more calculated. Victor had identified her dissatisfaction and fed on it. The long nights John spent building his empire, the endless charity galas, and the polished veneer of their life, all of it had left Clara yearning for something more, raw, more visceral. Victor had stepped into that void with precision, offering her the escape she craved. Fields provided John with surveillance footage. Clara and Victor in an intimate embrace at a luxury hotel bar, their body language speaking volumes. Clara's laugh was unguarded in a way John hadn't seen in years. Watching it felt like a dagger to his chest. Yet what chilled him more was the conversation that followed. "You've done well, Clara," Victor said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "With Emily on our side, it's just a matter of time. Once we've finished draining the accounts, we'll have enough to start fresh anywhere we want." Clara hesitated, her fingers playing with the rim of her glass. "And John? What happens when he finds out?" Victor leaned closer, his hand covering hers. "He won't. By the time he does, we'll be long gone. Besides," he smirked, "men like him never see it coming, too busy playing king of their little empires." John spent hours that night in his study staring at the footage. He wasn't just betrayed by a stranger, he was betrayed by his wife, the woman who had stood beside him through decades of triumphs and struggles. And his daughter, though perhaps unknowingly, was aiding in the destruction of everything he had built. Field's voice echoed in his head, "Victor's not just after your money, Mr. Mercer. He's after your identity. He wants to leave you powerless, humiliated." But Victor had underestimated one thing. John wasn't a victim, and he wasn't going to sit idly by while his family was torn apart. John began laying his own groundwork. He instructed Fields to dig deeper to uncover every detail of Victor's operations. Offshore accounts, aliases, shell companies, it all came together like a grotesque puzzle. Meanwhile, John's legal team discreetly began securing his assets, ensuring that any remaining funds were untouchable. At home he played the part of the oblivious husband and father. Clara's excuses, Emily's absences, he accepted them all with a forced smile, biding his time. The trap had to be perfect. One evening Clara returned late again. She kissed John on the cheek, her lipstick leaving a faint smear. "Work ran late," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Of course," John replied, his tone pleasant. "You've always been so dedicated." The irony of his words was lost on her, but it wasn't lost on John. The pieces were falling into place. The stage was set. Soon, Victor Hayes would learn what it meant to cross John Mercer. And, when the moment came, it wouldn't just be about reclaiming his money. It would be about reclaiming his family, his legacy, and ensuring Victor paid for every stolen moment, every whispered lie, and every fractured trust. John Mercer's plan required patience, precision, and a cold detachment that he hadn't realized he possessed. He told no one, not Clara, not Emily, not even his closest confidants. For weeks, he worked silently behind the scenes, orchestrating a trap so intricate that it would leave no room for Victor Hayes or his accomplices to escape. It began with the facade of a business trip. John informed Clara and Emily that he would be travelling to Europe for several weeks to negotiate an acquisition deal. Clara barely reacted to the news, offering a perfunctory "safe travels" as she scrolled through her phone. Emily, seated at the kitchen island, gave an absent nod, her eyes glued to her laptop. Their disinterest stung, but John buried his emotion. This was not the time for sentimentality. Before leaving, he coordinated with Graham Fields, the private investigator, to implement the final stage of surveillance. Tiny, inconspicuous cameras were installed throughout the estate. GPS trackers were discreetly placed on Clara's car and Emily's handbag. Every corner of their world was now under John's watchful eye, and they had no idea. His legal team, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to secure his holdings. Bank accounts were frozen, offshore assets were shifted into trusts, and company shares were shielded from unauthorized access. Clara and Emily were being cut off, their lifelines severed one by one. The business trip was a ruse, of course. John didn't leave for Europe. Instead, he relocated to a secure penthouse across town, equipped with a high-tech surveillance setup that gave him a front-row seat to the betrayal unfolding at his home. Each evening, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and watched as his wife and daughter entertained their guest. Victor Hayes entered the Mercer estate for the first time just 2 nights after John's supposed departure. He arrived in a sleek black sports car, his casual confidence apparent as he strode up the driveway. Clara greeted him at the door, her smile warmer than anything she had shown John in years. "Everything's ready?" she said, stepping aside to let him in. "Perfect," Victor replied, planting a kiss on her cheek. John's stomach churned, but he kept his emotions in check. His eyes remained fixed on the screen as Victor and Clara disappeared into the sitting room. Over the next few days, the extent of their duplicity became painfully clear. Victor wasn't just an opportunist looking to drain John's accounts. He was a master manipulator with a calculated plan. Through Clara and Emily, he had obtained access to sensitive documents, including corporate agreements, estate plans, and personal financial records. One night, as John watched the live feed, Victor spread a stack of papers across the coffee table. Emily sat beside him, her face alight with determination. These are the last of them," Emily said, holding up a folder. "With these, we'll have everything." Victor grinned. "You've done amazing work, Emily. Your father will never see it coming." John leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling. The sight of his daughter, his sweet, idealistic Emily, conspiring against him was a blow far worse than Clara's infidelity. The trap was set for Friday night. John ensured that his business trip itinerary would leave the estate vulnerable, with only Clara, Emily and Victor present. Fields monitored the property from a nearby van, while John watched from his penthouse. Victor arrived promptly at 8 p.m., a smug expression on his face as he parked his car in the driveway. Clara and Emily greeted him at the door, their demeanour as conspiratorial as ever. "Is everything ready?" Victor asked. Clara nodded. "The house is ours for the night. Let's finish this." They gathered in the study, unaware that their every move was being recorded. Victor opened a laptop and began transferring funds from John's business accounts to offshore entities. Emily assisted him, her hand steady as she navigated through the financial systems. Clara watched from the corner, her expression unreadable. "It's done," Emily said after an hour, leaning back in her chair. "Everything's transferred." Victor clapped her on the back. "You're brilliant, kid. Your dad never stood a chance." Clara smiled faintly but said nothing. As they celebrated their supposed victory, John made his move. From his secure location, he activated a series of pre-programmed commands that froze the accounts Victor had just drained. The transfers were reversed, and the stolen funds were rerouted back into John's secured trusts. Victor's laptop screen flashed red as an error message appeared. The hell?" Victor muttered, furiously typing on the keyboard. "The accounts are locked." Emily leaned over, panic etched on her face. "What do you mean, locked? We just transferred everything." "I don't know," Victor snapped. "It's like someone's blocking us." Clara's expression darkened. "You said this was foolproof, Victor." "It is," Victor growled. "Something's wrong. Someone's interfering." At that moment, the study door swung open. John stood in the doorway, his presence commanding and ice-cold. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm but laced with menace. The trio froze, their faces a mixture of shock and dread. Clara began, but he cut her off. "Don't," he said sharply. He stepped into the room, holding a tablet that displayed the live feed from the hidden cameras. "I've been watching. I know everything." Victor's bravado faltered, but he quickly recovered, flashing a disarming smile. "John, this isn't what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," John interrupted, his tone lethal. He turned to Emily, his voice softening just slightly. "You betrayed me, Emily. You betrayed our family." Emily's lip quivered, tears pooling in her eyes. "Dad, I thought... He said you were corrupt, that you..." "I built this family, Emily," John said, his voice rising. "I worked my entire life to give you and your mother everything, and this is how you repay me?" Clara stepped forward, her expression defiant. "Don't make this about loyalty, John. You were never around. You chose your empire over us." John stared at her, his face unreadable. "And you chose to sell me out to a con artist." The tension in the room was palpable as Victor edged toward the door. "You're not walking out of here," John said, his voice like steel. At his signal, Fields and his team entered the house, blocking Victor's escape. "We've already notified the authorities," Fields said. "You're done." Victor's composure cracked, and he lunged for the laptop, but Fields subdued him with practiced ease. As Victor was led away in handcuffs, John turned back to Clara and Emily. "I'll deal with you later," he said coldly. That night, as John stood alone in the now empty study, he felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. Betrayal had shattered his world, but it had also revealed the truth. And with the truth came clarity and the resolve to rebuild, no matter the cost. John Mercer sat alone in his penthouse, the glowing screens before him casting sharp shadows across his chiseled features. Every breath felt heavy as he watched the live feed from his estate. Each camera angle provided a clear view of the night's events, every movement and word recorded for evidence. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to send the final command that would activate the digital measures he had painstakingly prepared. Tonight was the night he would confirm the depth of his family's betrayal. Clara and Emily believed he was halfway across the Atlantic on a business trip, deep in negotiations that could make or break his company's next major venture. His well-executed cover had allowed him to remain undetected, every step of his plan unfolding with the same precision he applied to his business dealings. John wasn't just an empire builder, he was a strategist, and tonight his strategy would culminate in a revelation neither Clara nor Emily would forget. Victor Hayes arrived at precisely 8 p.m., his black sports car pulling into the Mercer Estate's circular driveway. He exited the vehicle with the casual arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. Dressed in a tailored blazer, he looked every bit the suave conman John had come to know through the private investigator's detailed reports. Clara met him at the door, her face lighting up in a way John hadn't seen in years. She kissed Victor on the cheek, the kind of kiss that was more intimate than polite. "Everything's ready," Clara said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "Good!" Victor's voice carried a self-assured smoothness, tinged with excitement. John watched as Victor placed a small briefcase on the foyer table. He already knew its contents: forged documents, offshore account access codes, and other tools of manipulation. Clara led him to the study, where Emily was waiting, a laptop open in front of her, and a stack of papers neatly arranged. "Hey, Vic!" Emily greeted him with an enthusiasm that stung John more than he'd expected. "Emily," Victor said warmly, "our star player." "Wee, wee, wee." The three settled into the study, and Victor got to work. John's stomach tightened as he observed Victor navigate his personal accounts and corporate ledgers with practiced ease, guiding Emily through the transfers. The sight of his daughter, his brilliant, idealistic daughter, taking notes and providing passwords, felt like a knife twisting in his chest. "This is the last of the funds," Emily said after an hour, handing Victor a USB drive. "With these, we'll have everything." Victor grinned, leaning back in the leather chair. "Your dad never saw it coming. You've done incredible work, Emily." Clara poured herself a glass of wine and raised it in a mock toast. "To fresh starts," she said, her voice calm, yet smug. "To freedom," Victor added, clinking his glass against hers. Emily hesitated, her brow furrowing for the briefest moment. "I just hope this is the right thing," she said. "What if your dad has been hoarding wealth built on other people's suffering," Victor interjected smoothly. "This is about justice, Emily. We're fixing what he broke." John's jaw tightened as he listened to Victor's lies. He could feel the carefully constructed image his daughter had of him being eroded with every word Victor spoke. He hated the man more for the damage he had done to Emily's trust than for the theft itself. While the trio celebrated, John initiated the first stage of his counterattack. From his laptop, he activated the programs that his legal and cybersecurity teams had developed over the past few weeks. One by one, the accounts Victor had accessed froze, the stolen funds redirected back to their original sources. In the study, Victor's expression shifted from smug to confused as his laptop emitted a series of warning beeps. "What's happening?" Clara asked, her voice sharp with alarm. Victor furiously typed on the keyboard, his confidence unraveling. The accounts are locked. It's like someone's blocked us." "What do you mean, blocked?" Emily leaned over his shoulder, panic etched on her face. Victor slammed the laptop shut, his calm veneer cracking. "Something's wrong. This shouldn't be happening." Before Clara could respond, the sound of the study door opening made all three turn. John stepped into the room, his presence filling the space with an almost suffocating intensity. "Having some trouble?" he asked, his tone as sharp as a blade. Clara froze, her wineglass slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. Emily looked as though she had seen a ghost. Victor, ever the performer, attempted to recover his composure. "John," Victor said, forcing a smile, "this isn't what it looks like." John took a step closer, his eyes like steel. "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like," he said coldly. He turned to Emily, his voice softening just slightly. "I trusted you, Emily. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "Dad, I thought—" Victor said— "Victor lied," John snapped, his tone hardening, "and you were foolish enough to believe him." Clara stepped forward, attempting to regain control. "John, if you'd been around more, maybe none of this would have happened. You chose your company over your family." John's eyes burned into hers. "And you chose to destroy your family for a fantasy." Victor seized the moment to make a break for it, darting toward the door, but John was prepared. A signal from his phone brought Graham Fields and 2 security personnel rushing into the room, blocking Victor's escape. "Take him," John ordered. Victor fought against them, but it was futile. As he was dragged out, he turned to Clara and Emily. "Don't worry," he called out. "We'll fix this. He can't stop us." Clara looked pale, her confident demeanor crumbling. Emily was sobbing quietly, her face buried in her hands. John turned to his wife and daughter, his expression unreadable. "You both made your choices," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Now you'll live with the consequences." In the aftermath, the house was eerily silent. Clara retreated to their bedroom, while Emily remained in the study, staring at the ruined plans scattered across the desk. John stood outside, the cool night air soothing the storm within him. He wasn't sure what hurt more, his wife's betrayal or his daughter's complicity. He knew that rebuilding would take time, not just his finances, but his family, or what was left of it. For now, though, he had done what he needed to do. He had faced the betrayal, revealed the truth, and taken control. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, John returned to the study. Emily looked up, her face streaked with tears. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking, "I'm sorry." John said nothing for a moment, the weight of the night pressing on his chest. Finally, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll talk," he said quietly. "But not tonight. For now, that was enough." John Mercer returned to the estate the evening after the confrontation, not as the man who had left weeks earlier, but as someone transformed by the truth he had uncovered. He walked through the grand entrance with a measured pace, his presence heavy with purpose. Clara and Emily were waiting for him in the sitting room, their expressions tense. They had spent the day in uneasy silence, the weight of their actions now crashing down around them. The sitting room, once a space of warmth and family gatherings, now felt cold and foreign. The fireplace cast long shadows across the polished floor, flickering light reflecting off the gilded frames of family photos that suddenly seemed hollow. Clara sat stiffly on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Emily fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, her eyes darting nervously to her father. John entered, his movements deliberate. He carried a folder, its contents clearly significant, and placed it on the coffee table between them. For a moment he said nothing, letting the silence settle over the room like a shroud. Then he spoke, his voice calm but cutting. "I hope you both enjoyed your little adventure," he began, gesturing to the folder, "because it's over now." Clara was the first to speak, her voice defensive. "John, if you just—" "Don't," he interrupted sharply, holding up a hand. "Don't even try to justify what you've done. I know everything. The stolen money, the lies, the meetings with Victor. I know about the accounts, the fake charities, and the plans to bleed me dry." Emily's lip trembled, and she looked down, tears threatening to spill. "Dad, I didn't mean— You didn't mean to—" "What?" John snapped, his tone unrelenting. "To betray me, to steal from me, or to conspire with a man who played you both like puppets." Emily broke into a sob, burying her face in her hands. Clara, however, straightened her spine, her expression hardening. "This isn't all on us," Clara said, her voice cold. "You neglected this family for years, John. You were so consumed with your empire, you didn't even notice us slipping away." John's laugh was bitter. Neglect? Is that your excuse? While I was working to provide everything for you, this house, your charity projects, Emily's education, you were planning to take it all away. You think money replaces love? Clara shot back. You were never here. You can't buy a family, John. Maybe not, he replied, his voice quieter but no less cutting. But I didn't expect my family to sell me out. He turned to Emily, softening his tone slightly. Emily, you're my daughter. How could you believe him? That everything I've built came from corruption? Emily looked up, her tear-streaked face pale. Victor, he made it sound so real. He said you ruined lives to get where you are. I thought I was doing something good. John sighed deeply, the weight of her words pressing down on him. I raised you to think critically, Emily, to question things. Instead, you let a stranger fill your head with lies. The room fell into silence again, heavy and suffocating. Finally, John stood, picking up the folder from the table. This, he said, holding it up, contains the evidence of everything you've done, the stolen funds, the fraudulent accounts, even the surveillance footage of your meetings with Victor. Clara's face drained of colour. You wouldn't, she whispered. Wouldn't I? John countered. Victor is already in custody. Do you think I'd hesitate to protect myself, my business, and what's left of this family? The next morning, Clara found her belongings packed and waiting by the door. A manila envelope sat on top of the suitcase. Divorce papers. She looked at John, who stood in the foyer, his expression unreadable. I'll make sure you're comfortable, he said, his tone formal. But you're no longer a part of this family. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She had gambled everything and lost. Without another word, she picked up her suitcase and walked out of the house, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Emily watched from the top of the stairs, her heart breaking as she saw her mother leave. She turned to her father, her voice trembling. What about me? John looked up at her, his gaze softer than it had been the night before, but still resolute. That depends on you, Emily. Over the next few weeks, John worked tirelessly to reclaim control of his life and his legacy. His legal team froze every account Victor and Clara had touched, recovering most of the stolen money. They worked with the authorities to ensure Victor faced the full weight of the law, his schemes exposed in meticulous detail. For Emily, John took a different approach. He didn't cut her off entirely, but he made it clear that trust had to be rebuilt. Her access to family funds was revoked, and she was tasked with proving her sincerity through action, not words. John arranged for her to meet with a therapist, encouraging her to unravel the reasons she had been so easily manipulated. I'm giving you a chance, Emily, he told her one evening as they sat in the study. Don't waste it. Emily nodded, tears in her eyes. I won't, Dad. I promise. As for Clara, she disappeared into obscurity. Stripped of the life she had grown accustomed to, she was left to face the consequences of her choices. John didn't look back. He had made his peace with her betrayal, focusing instead on rebuilding what she had tried to destroy. Victor's arrest became a media spectacle, his history of cons and manipulations laid bare. For John, the public vindication was bittersweet. He had always valued his privacy, but the exposure of Victor's crimes brought a sense of justice, if not closure. Months later, John stood in his study, staring at a photo of Emily as a child. Her bright smile and wide eyes reminded him of a time when things had been simpler, when trust hadn't been a question. A handwritten letter lay on his desk, Emily's latest attempt to apologize and show her commitment to making amends. John sighed, folding the letter and tucking it into the drawer. He wasn't ready to forgive her fully, not yet. But he was willing to watch, to see if she could rebuild the trust she had broken. As he turned back to his desk, the estate felt quieter than ever, the echoes of betrayal lingering like shadows. But John Mercer was no stranger to rebuilding. His empire had been forged in the fires of challenge and adversity, and now, so would his family. Because if there was one thing John had learned through all of this, it was that betrayal didn't define him. It refined him. And he would rise, stronger and wiser, to ensure no one ever took advantage of him again. The morning light poured through the tall windows of John Mercer's study. illuminating the room that had once felt like a sanctuary, but now carried the weight of everything that had happened. The chaos of the past few months had left scars, not the visible kind, but those that settled deep within. Yet the stillness of the estate was no longer oppressive. It was the quiet of survival, of rebuilding. John leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting over the piles of documents and financial reports stacked on his desk. Each sheet represented a piece of his empire that had been saved, fortified against the damage Clara and Victor had attempted to inflict. The money had been recovered, the accounts secured, and Victor Hayes's web of deceit dismantled. His arrest had made headlines, ensuring that Victor's name would never again inspire trust. But it wasn't the financial losses that had wounded John the most. It was the betrayal by the people he loved, people he had trusted without question. Clara was gone, the divorce finalized in record time thanks to airtight prenuptial agreements. Emily was still here, though their relationship remained fragile, a thread stretched taut, neither broken nor mended. John's fingers traced the edge of a photograph on his desk. It was an old one, taken years ago during a family vacation to the Amalfi Coast. Clara's smile was radiant, her arm looped around his, while a teenage Emily grinned beside them, her eyes filled with trust and admiration. He felt a pang of sorrow. That version of his family no longer existed, and perhaps it never had. The weeks following Clara's departure were a time of transition. The house, once vibrant with activity, now seemed subdued. Emily had retreated into herself, her usual spirited demeanour replaced by quiet introspection. She had written letters, left notes on his desk, each one an attempt to explain, to apologise, to plead for forgiveness. John read them all, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. He wanted to forgive her, to believe that she had been naive rather than malicious, a victim rather than an accomplice. But trust was not something he could easily rebuild, not after seeing her sit beside Victor, helping him siphon away the life John had worked so hard to create. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, John decided it was time to address the unspoken tension between them. "Emily," he began, his voice steady, "I need to understand something." "Why?" She looked up, her fork pausing mid-air. "Why what?" "Ah, wouldn't you believe him? Why did you think I could be the monster he made me out to be?" Emily placed her fork down, her hands trembling slightly. "He made it sound so convincing, Dad. The stories, the evidence he showed me, it all felt real. And I wanted to believe I was doing something good, helping people who'd been hurt." John's gaze softened, though his tone remained firm. "And you didn't think to ask me, to question what he was feeding you?" "I didn't want to," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I was angry at you. For always being so distant, for putting work first. It was easier to believe him than to confront how I felt about us." "Ah." John sighed deeply, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "Emily, I've made mistakes, I see that now. But no matter how busy I was, my love for you never wavered. Everything I've done has been for you, for us." Tears welled in her eyes. "I know, Dad, I see that now. I'm so sorry." Their conversation was a turning point, but the road to reconciliation was far from smooth. John set firm boundaries, making it clear that trust had to be earned. Emily threw herself into repairing the damage she had caused, volunteering at local charities and pursuing her studies with renewed determination. She even offered to work part-time at one of John's companies, a gesture he appreciated but didn't immediately accept. "I want you to find your own path," he told her one morning as they walked the estate grounds. "Not because you feel obligated to me, but because it's what you want." Emily nodded, a hint of a smile breaking through her sombre expression. "I'll make you proud, Dad." "You always have," he said quietly, "even when I forgot to tell you." As for Clara, her absence was palpable but not mourned. She had disappeared into obscurity, taking a modest settlement and the knowledge that she had been outmaneuvered. Occasionally, John would catch whispers of her name in society circles, but they were fleeting, like echoes of a life that no longer concerned him. Victor's trial became a media spectacle, with details of his schemes splashed across every major outlet. John attended the proceedings only once, sitting in the back of the courtroom as Victor faced his accusers. He didn't stay for the verdict. He didn't need to. Justice, he knew, would come, whether through the courts or through the quiet misery of a conman who had lost his power. Let me repeat that right back to you. One more time, read. Obscure. Music drifted through the greenhouse, back to its former home station, the melody changing from one of companionship and love. Emily joined him, a basket of fresh herbs in her hands. "I think I might apply for that internship in Geneva," she said hesitantly. John looked up, surprised. "Geneva? That's far." "I need a fresh start," she explained, "and I think you do too." He smiled faintly, brushing dirt from his hands. "You're right. Maybe we both need to step out of the shadows of the past." They worked side by side in silence for a while, the air between them no longer heavy with tension, but filled with the quiet understanding of two people learning to rebuild. That evening, John returned to his study and opened a locked drawer. Inside was a letter Clara had written to him before leaving, a final attempt to justify her actions. He read it one last time, then placed it in the fireplace, watching the flames consume the words. As the fire crackled, John felt a sense of closure. The betrayals had left their mark, but they had also taught him resilience. He would never be the same man he was before Victor Hayes entered his life. But perhaps that wasn't a bad thing. Looking out the window at the darkened estate, John allowed himself a moment of reflection. The future was uncertain, but it was his to shape. For the first time in months, he felt ready to face it.